Good morning, everyone. We're letting everyone from the waiting room right now. Thanks everyone for jumping on. So just everyone knows if you can just try to make sure your computers are on mute. This is just a regular Zoom. We're just all getting together as friends this morning to go over some new legislation. So just make sure I can mute people from my computer, but if you can just try to make sure they're muted,
I
that
use
would
the
be helpful.
master, which is this one here, but then I have all FTEs. This is what we started to put together. But then Cheryl,
There you go. I'll be on mute police. Okay, Jen, you still with me?
And
All right, perfect. So we still have people coming through the waiting room, so I will do my best to get everyone in from the waiting room as we go. So we are recording, just so everyone knows, recording is going on. We will have the slides going out afterwards like we always do. So we'll give everyone just another minute. We have a couple more people diving in here. And before we get into the actual presentation, we're just gonna do a quick welcome for ironically for myself and the Apex team. I see familiar faces, but we as Apex are probably familiar to some, not familiar to all. So we'll just do a quick run through, and then we have some great information coming on the new Wage Act coming up in 2025 for Massachusetts. We're going to do a quick refresher for anyone that's kind of been around our circles for a while. Jen did a pay equity audit webinar for us a few years ago. So we're going to redo that, as that's going to be pretty important as we get going. The message and chat is open. So as questions come through, we'll try to feed that in. We have 90 minutes today. I don't believe we're going to take that whole time. So hopefully we can give everyone a little bit of time back in their day. But with that, I am going to get us moving. So we want to thank everyone for joining. This is the first kind of public webinar that we've done here at Apex Benefits Partners. So I want to thank everyone that's on the call for joining us. It's really important to us. It's something that obviously people that know me, I've been out in the marketplace doing this for dating back to 2019 and PFML with Jen as a partner right here along our side. So we're very excited about it. So I'm just going to take a brief minute just to kind of introduce us, who we are at Apex, kind of what our goal is in the marketplace moving forward as we kind of get out of the infancy of our organization. Some familiar names you're going to see here. So myself, John Foley, Kelly, and Don set out to create this Apex Benefits Partners organization. We're extremely excited. It's something that we really wanted to try to do something different in the employee benefits space. Health insurance and benefits is something that's kind of been done the same way for as long as I've been in the industry, for 20 plus years now. So, we wanted to try to create a little bit different experience. Anyone knows me knows that we kind of hit on all of the main things you'd expect from a benefits side of things. Obviously, helping with benefits. The PFA is something we're pretty passionate about. We'll talk about that as we go through. Physical, mental wellness, and well-being. Everyone on the call is kind of going to get a preview of a big initiative we have coming out in 2025 on the wellness and well-being side of things, including, you see nutritional consultation there. We're going to do that at the end, but everyone's going to kind of see that. And our last little bubble here is the one that we obviously spend a lot of time on, is market and legislative updates. So we're expecting the market and legislative updates to sort of have a little bit of an uptick in this coming up year. Obviously, we have a new administration in from a presidency standpoint. Congress and the House has sort of shifted. So we're expecting some different things happening this year. We don't know what's coming, but we're prepared to make sure that we have all the people like Jen and her team, and then some of our other partners on the tax side of things, to bring all this information to the marketplace. So something that we have a lot of passion for, this actually came from a book. One of my clients referred me this book. It's Patrick Lencioni and the Advantage. And he delineated organizations between smart organizations and healthy organizations. And that's something that really kind of hit home with us, where, smart organizations, that's the blocking and tackling of running your business. We obviously, that's what we're doing today. Legislative updates kind of hit that blocking and tackling. But we like going the extra mile into that healthy organization, where you are actually digging into your corporate culture. We want to be an extension of that corporate culture. It's something that anyone that works with us knows. We created this, our mission statement. We went the Chick-fil-A route, where Chick-fil-A, their mission statement is eat more chicken. We went a similar route with a very simple mission statement of clients come first. And, everyone knows that's ever worked at a big company, small company, medium-sized company. There's different orders of operations of how business needs to get done. And from our standpoint, right, wrong, or indifferent, we want to make sure that business gets done where clients' needs are prioritized over everything else. So that's kind of our mission here. And with that, I just want to thank everyone again for joining. Part of what we've done over the course of our time is make unbelievable partnerships with people in the marketplace. People that know me, Jen and I have done, oh my goodness, Jen, at this point, I don't even want to count how many of these we've done. They're out there on YouTube somewhere, where if people really want to watch Jen and I chit chat over what went on in 2019 and 2020 through COVID, they're all out there. So, but Jen has been an invaluable partner of ours for a long time. Not only is Jen awesome, but she is officially a super lawyer as well. So that's a super cool title. So, but Jen is going to take it over from here. We're going to dig into this Wage Transparency Act. Anyone with any questions, as always, I'll keep an eye on the chat. We'll weave things in as we can. If I know these questions are kind of coming, we'll make sure to I'll hold off on them and know that we'll weave them in, but we will have time at the end as well. So Miss Jennifer,
So
the stage
good
is
morning,
yours.
everyone. Thank you, Jeff, for having me. I'm so excited for you and your team at Apex Benefits Partners. I'm excited to join you here this morning to talk a little bit about a new law that everyone is going to have to get up to speed on in 2025, and that's pay transparency. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'll certainly get to those, or if you have any hypotheticals, we'd be happy to address them in the chat. So what's happening with pay transparency? As most of you know, in 2024, there was a new law that passed. What I will say is that I actually know the people that were very involved in creating and drafting this law. And I'm friendly with Megan Driscoll Greenstein, who was one of the women on the forefront of this act. And one thing that they did differently is they really did bring the business community to the table during the drafting process. So AIM and the Boston Chamber of Commerce and other business-minded groups were at the table when this legislation was crafted. Why that's important to all of you is because it is a little bit more moderate and a little bit more business friendly than maybe some of the other laws that we've talked about in the past. And I'll kind of point out those differences and distinctions as we go through today. But what I will say is this is a little bit more of a common sense approach, and it does make sense. And I think it's not as progressive in nature as some of the other pay transparency laws across the country are. So that's a good thing for Massachusetts employers. One of the parts of the law becomes effective on October 30th, 2025, and many of you already know what that is. It impacts employers that have 25 employees in Massachusetts or more. And what that requires is that you post pay ranges for positions on all job postings. Whether those positions are internal or external, you need to have a pay range. Right now, there's not a lot of definition as to what pay range means, how large of a pay range could be. There's not a lot of information out there as of yet. So I think that as long as there's a pay range posted, even if it's very large of a gap, if it's $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, depending on the position, I think that you're going to satisfy your requirement. The Massachusetts Attorney General is going to be conducting a public awareness campaign as we get into 2025. That really hasn't started yet. We've received no written guidance as of yet on this law, but we will hop on again, I'm sure, Jeff and I, once the written guidance does come out and we get a little bit more information from the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. We're hoping she develops some FAQs or some other guidance that will help employers to make sure that they're compliant moving forward. So you're only required to disclose the pay range, and that's going to be base salary and or your hourly rate. You are not required to disclose any potential bonuses, profit sharing, commissions, or the like. So that's something to just keep in mind. You don't have to disclose the full compensation package, just the annual base salary or the hourly rate. So hopefully that's helpful. Jeff, any comment on any of that?
No, I think we've seen this come through. So if anyone has any employees in New York, you know that this happened in New York a few years ago, and it created a little bit of an upheaval. So as we go through, that something that Jen's been so fantastic at doing for us is obviously the law is the law. We have to follow the law, but there's going to be all different kinds of potential problems that are adjacent to this legislation coming up that we want to basically sort of put out in the open so that we can be prepared for that. So I think as we get through, Jen will kind of hit on some of those, but and a question that obviously for someone in sales myself, that this was the first thing I thought of as well, but information sharing on fully commissionable employees is a question
Yeah,
that
I mean, I
that
think
came
that you
in.
would specifically put into any job posting that it's a fully commission based employee, 100% commission. And you could always put in some ranges on potential. As far as if you have a history of people typically earning X to Y on these types of positions, you could certainly put that in. But obviously, if it's a 100% commission employee, they only make what they receive for commissions. But usually there are some specific issues as far as minimum wage is concerned with fully commissioned employees. So usually there's a draw and things like that. So that's something that if you have specific questions on fully commissioned employees and how to word that, would be happy to help, or certainly consult your legal team to make sure you're handling it properly. And maybe the Massachusetts Attorney General's office will give us some more guidance on that.
Yeah, Jen, a couple things. I know we're going to talk about a couple dates here. February 1st is a date, but there are a couple questions coming in that they've seen a couple different dates where one was July 31st and one was October 30th. So do we know? I know I think something had happened where they said it would start like a year from when it was originally signed, but we know the two major dates that we've seen here are February 1st, there's some reporting requirements, and then October 30th, there's some that's basically when everything we hit the ground running with this new legislation.
Yes, exactly. So my understanding is that the requirement for job postings is going to be that October 30th deadline.
Okay. And then just while we're here, we might as well grab a couple of questions. Obviously, since COVID, we've gotten into companies have looked for talent, obviously, in other areas besides so a Massachusetts-based company would always hire in Mass. Now, obviously, that's not necessarily, you could hire someone from anywhere in the country now for a remote position. So does it delineate between, hey, if we're a Mass employee, I'll just use if Apex wants to hire someone, we found a great person in wherever, North Carolina, would we have to disclose that, or is it just for hiring within Massachusetts?
I would definitely disclose the pay range going forward if you're a Massachusetts employer. And I think that one of the things with remote positions that we've talked to many of our employers about, also people with multi-jurisdictions, whether they have offices in varied states, you really have to think about what states you're operating in and where there are pay transparency laws. And you want to comply with the most stringent requirements if you're going to be hiring in those states. So you should be conducting your own little audit on, okay, which states do we employ employees in? Where are we advertising for? Where are we posting? And if there are remote positions, you still want to include that pay range in those job postings for sure.
And does it define actual range versus, so a question came in about the budgeted allowable salary within like a policy. Does it have to be like the actual range, or can it be within that budgeted allowable salary?
I definitely think it could be the budgeted allowable salary. And the law is pretty clear that it's what you think you're going to pay this particular person. If in reality you end up hiring and it's slightly different, there is a little bit of leeway in the way that the act is written, but you do need to have a good faith basis for what the pay range is and why you're putting it out there in that way.
Okay. Awesome.
So pay reporting, I think that was one of the things why we wanted to get on this in December right now and talk a little bit about this. That new requirement is going to be February 1st, 2025. Again, there really hasn't been much guidance issued. I did actually have a call with Megan Driscoll Greenstein about the pay reporting yesterday, just to see kind of where the Commonwealth is at on this. Josh Cutler he's the undersecretary at the Economic Office of Workforce and Development. We found out yesterday that there's still no official guidance on how this reporting is going to happen, but we're hopeful that more guidance is forthcoming. This is going to apply to employers that have 100 or more employees in Massachusetts. So they're subject to the EEO-1 reporting requirement already. Now, there's been a lot of questions on whether or not it's just going to be the EEO-1 form that gets filed with the Commonwealth, or whether there's going to be some addendum. Currently, the EEO-1 does not have a wage data component to it. It's all just demographics. For those large employers on the call, you know what I'm talking about. And so we're not sure whether or not the AG or the Economic Development Workforce, if they're going to give us a little bit more information on what is going to be required and what's going to be submitted. We're hoping after the first of the year, we get some more information. What I would say is it's incumbent on all the employers on this call that have 100 or more employees to begin to get prepared to comply. And that means to gather your wage data so that you know you have it readily available, which I think usually using most of your payroll reports, you should be able to gather this information fairly easily. But you want to make sure that you're on top of it so that when February 1st rolls around, you're not behind if you need to submit that wage data to the Commonwealth.
Yeah, and Jen, that's a question I've had a couple times where it doesn't leave a whole lot of time because we have a lot of unknown questions and we're, a week or so away from Christmas, and then all of a sudden it's New Year's, and then we're in January and this is due at the end of January. So it says it's due in February, but we're really 30 days. This is like kind of a priority one for these companies over 100 employees in January. So I think part of our messaging today is just to make sure this is on your radar. And although we might not have all the answers today, this needs to be on your radar and a priority between realistically probably the end of the year. I'm sure you're closing out your years right now with all the things that you need to do, but it needs to be a priority kind of early in January. And hopefully, like what happened with PFML and COVID, where we weren't getting answers until the 11th hour, and then there were reporting requirements, the next day, just be prepared for something to kind of happen, and make sure that you have time budgeted for handling some of this in January.
Yes, exactly. I think that you just want to be ready. The EEO-1 form for 2025 isn't even out. I mean, I looked yesterday to see if I could get on the EEOC portal for the EEO-1 form, and it won't even let you get onto the portal. There's sample forms that are available, so you can kind of get a sense of what the current EEO-1 form looks like, just so in case you haven't had any familiarity with it, you could take a look at that. But right now, that particular form isn't even out on the EEOC website. So I think that obviously, hopefully, right after the first of the year, we'll have some more information. This form is going to be submitted to the Massachusetts Secretary of State. The Secretary of State is then going to work with the Executive Office of Labor and Workforce Development, and the Workforce Development Office is going to be publishing aggregate wage data in July after receiving all of these reports. That's what the specific statute says as of now. So again, the wage data reports, EEO-1, EEO-3, EEO-4, EEO-5, most of the employers on this call are going to be EEO-1 filers. The 3, 4, and 5 are unions, municipalities, state agencies, things like that. So EEO-1 applies to just traditional companies. So just so you know, that's going to be something that's going to have to be submitted to the Massachusetts Secretary of State, a completed copy of all required components of the employer information report as issued by the EEOC, including any any information that's required on that report, demographic, pay data, race, ethnicity, sex, job category. Those are the parts of the form that are the entire form is going to need to be completed and submitted to the Massachusetts Secretary of State.
And Jen, I know we don't have any of that information yet, but this is more an opinion question for you. Are we expecting any surprises as to what they're requiring, or is it going to be more something standard, what we kind of would expect?
I think the only thing that's really up in the air is whether or not they're going to have this additional wage data component, which is the whole purpose of the law, whether or not that's going to be required. There's been a lot of scuttlebutt and a lot of lawyers saying different things in the marketplace, because I know I've attended several webinars on this topic. I've also been reading up on it, and many people are saying, well, it's just the EEO-1 form that's going to be required. And so that right now doesn't include wage data. So that form will be submitted to the Massachusetts Secretary of State, but right now it doesn't require wage data. We don't know whether there's going to be further guidance on that and whether or not wage data will be required. Prior versions of the EEO-1 form did require wage data. So the last year form, the last couple of years, I think it was like 2017, 2018, they required wage data. Since then, the federal government has not. So that's the big unknown right now. So what I would advise is be prepared, be ready to submit wage data, but we don't really know what's going to be required. We do know the EEO-1 must be submitted to the Secretary of State. We're not sure whether additional components are going to be required to that.
Right. So again, as a part of obviously we want to like to have actionable takeaways when we do these. I would start compiling that with the expectation that it's going to be needed, even though it's not on there right now. Again, as a takeaway, set some time aside in January for your teams, in early January, I would say, just to start compiling that information. Should be, I'll say this loosely, should be easy enough to pull out of any, HRIS platform, et cetera. But we just don't want to have any surprises where guidance gets issued, January 12th, and all of a sudden all different kinds of information is needed, and you're looking at it for the first time then. So I think that's a big takeaway from this. Very similar to what we did, years back going into PFML and COVID. Just try to be over prepared so that you're not kind of in a pinch at the last minute.
Agreed. So remember at the outset, I told you that this is a little different than some of the other laws. And I think that's a good thing for employers. What is different is that the enforcement of this law, there is no private right of action. An employee or prospective employee cannot sue you if you don't have the pay range out there. Okay, so that's great. You're not concerned that there's going to be a lawsuit. So what would happen? It's only going to be enforced by the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. The first offense is only going to be a warning. So that's huge. You don't see that very often, right? You're just going to get a slap on the wrist if you don't have those pay ranges. I think they're more interested in education to the employers and getting people up to speed than having people sue employers. And I think a lot of that comes from having businesses at the table during the lobbying process and during the crafting of this bill. So second offense, a fine of not more than $500, third offense, $1,000, and you can see the rest of the offenses listed on this particular slide. So you can see it's a lot less of a risk for employers if they don't comply or if they're not as up to speed, because there's so many businesses out there that have no idea that this is happening and that it's going to be a requirement. And so, you all on this call, I know will be very well prepared and you're not going to have to worry about getting fined or anything else. But those small companies that may historically not have posted pay ranges do not have to worry about litigious individuals or lawyers just scouring Indeed and filing suit. So that's a good thing. And again, I think that really comes from the business community being at the table.
Yeah, and I would say one thing I will say about that, as we've been looking, I've been talking with clients and companies across the state looking for talent, looking for good people that fit their culture, et cetera. I understand, like Jen will echo, obviously it's great that there's no penalties here and et cetera. But what we want to make sure is that, the optics for a business that, and we assume everyone on this call, as Jen said, is gonna, do as the law says. The optics for the businesses that don't can show a little bit of again, if we're looking to make a cultural, to basically say something that our culture, it's important to us. We want to treat our employees right. Sometimes not posting these can have a little bit of a deception to it, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it. So it's great that there aren't penalties. No one wants to get sued, obviously, for not posting any of this, but I think it's something to kind of own that you're proud of what you do for your employees. It speaks to your benefits package as a whole. Pay is obviously a big part of your total rewards package. So being open and honest about it, I think is something that I think it's something that you can kind of hang your hat on as an employer, that, yeah, there's no secrets for us. We're putting this out in the marketplace. We're confident in this, et cetera. So one question came in, Jen. So is one offense and the resulting fine based on each job posting, or one employer who might have multiple job postings at a time? So how do they define an offense, per employer or per job posting?
They define an offense to include one or more job posting for positions made by the same employer during a 48-hour period. So to the extent you have one or a few posts that happen this week and then a few more posts next week, obviously the next week posts are a different offense, right? So to the extent you have a lot of job postings, the fines could get up there depending on how many postings you have going on at any given time.
Okay.
But again, the first offense is going to be a warning. So I think that after someone receives a letter from the Attorney General with a warning, I would hope that they would get up to speed.
Right. Awesome.
So before we move on to Massachusetts Pay Equity, or MEPA, I want to kind of take any questions on the new Pay Transparency Act that we have. And obviously we can weave it into Mass Pay Equity too, but I'd love to kind of hear any questions. I did want to go back to the effective date just to answer that question a little bit more thoroughly. So this law was something that said it would be taking effect 1 year from the date of passage. It passed in July, but it had a 90-day period where the law to take effect. So that's why it's an October 2025 effective date. So just so you know, the law doesn't take effect till October 2025, that portion that relates to pay range disclosure. I just wanted to make sure everybody was clear on that. It's not July 2025, it is October, due to the 90-day delay in effective date.
Right, and we had a question come in on, if hiring rates, their CBA has hiring rates only, no range and no maximums. So how would you try to put a salary range in if that's what you're looking at from a hiring standpoint?
So I'm not sure I understand what a hiring rate is. I'm pulling up the chat question now.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Gene, if you want to expand on that, we'll definitely weave that in. And then the other thing, Jen, so if
it's a clear rate, like $17 an hour, you're good. You don't need a pay range, right? If that's the question, if it's clear cut on this is the rate we pay, then that's disclosure of wage. So that, yes. So I think that in the chat, she just put it's a flat rate. That's totally fine. And that's what you would put in. There is no range, but it is disclosure of what the person is going to be hired at. And that's really what the law is aimed to do, right? Because previously employers didn't have to put anything at all if they didn't want to. And then they could get people in and say, what do you want to be paid? And then they could lowball different people if the individual had low expectations. Now the Commonwealth is requiring that pay transparency, but clear hiring rates is clearly pay transparency, right? You're disclosing a very specific hourly rate, and so you would be in compliance. It doesn't have to be a range, it can be specifically a rate.
Great.
Any other questions, Jeff, that you saw in the chat?
I don't see any other specific ones, other than getting to the pay equity is kind of going to get to one of the adjacent problems that they saw in New York when it came to wage transparency, which was, if you're posting wage ranges or posting specific salaries for a job and then trying to, after the fact, close the gap with any problems that you may have internally where someone working in that position is maybe not getting paid up to par. That's where it can create. So again, everything, the law is the law, and Jen's fantastic on going through that. But what we also want to bring is what problems can potentially arise from this law being put in place. And that's where sometimes you can't prepare for everything. As we know through COVID, we definitely couldn't prepare for everything that came at us. But if we can try to give just some, maybe keep an eye out for this, maybe double check this doesn't happen. This pay equity topic kind of gets into that to make sure that if there are gaps there, it doesn't create an internal cultural struggle with, well, this job just got posted. I work that same job and I work harder than everyone else and yada, yada. That's more than I make, something along those lines. Those are the conversations we're trying to avoid. With a strong culture within your organization, usually those can be smoothed over through, any type of career building or anything like that. But we want to make sure that those are the type of issues that popped up in New York and in a competitive hiring marketplace. I think the hiring marketplace has done a 180 3 times in the last 4 years, where it went from everyone needed talent, then great resignation, then layoffs. And now we're kind of back in a situation where I think a lot of good talent is out there, but companies are also looking. So it's a unique part of the hiring marketplace, where there's a little bit of a give and take, where I think everyone would be more than willing to bring top talent on. And I think just the point of the pay equity audit is to maybe get in front of some of the problems that this Wage Transparency Act may cause. That makes sense?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that's why MEPA, the Massachusetts Pay Equity Act, really goes hand in hand with this new law. And that's why I think it's important that we remind ourselves what Massachusetts Pay Equity requires, because now is the time to think about pay equity because you're disclosing pay ranges, right? And what does the Massachusetts Pay Equity law require as it relates to these pay ranges? So these two laws really work hand in hand. And I thought it was important to do a little quick refresh on pay equity while we were here talking about pay transparency. So as you might recall, in 2018, Massachusetts passed a basic prohibition against discrimination in pay. So no employer shall discriminate in any way on the basis of gender in the payment of wages. And so this is very important. We need to be thinking about this. What is comparable work? What are permissible pay differences? We want to make sure we're thinking about this. And this is, again, to close the gender gap that still exists even in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has some of the strongest equal pay laws in the country, and women still earn an average of 81 cents for every dollar a man makes. So the point of pay transparency is to close that gap. The point of the Massachusetts Pay Equity Law was to close that gap. So those are the things, these are the reasons why these laws work hand in hand. And Jeff, if you could turn to the next slide, we'll get into what MEPA covers. So MEPA covers nearly all employers in Massachusetts. There's no size requirement, not like pay transparency, which has those 25 and 100 employee requirements. MEPA reaches employers located outside of Massachusetts also if they have employees with their primary place of employment in Massachusetts. And it doesn't matter where the employee lives, whether they're remote or not. So again, very broad Massachusetts pay equity law. And then what is wages or comparable work? Wages are all forms of remuneration, which includes commissions, bonuses, all of the remuneration that an employee receives. And it's very broad and inclusive. So it's different than pay transparency, which is only those base pay or hourly rate disclosures. What is comparable work? What the law is clear about is comparable work isn't just a job title. You really need to look more deeply and determine if it's substantially similar, meaning the job requires a similar level of skill, effort, and responsibility, has similar working conditions, shifts, physical surroundings, hazards. Job titles and descriptions alone do not specifically mean anything, right? You've got to dig deeper on whether or not something is comparable or not. And that's where the pay equity audit comes in. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. what are some permissible reasons to pay people differently? Obviously, not everyone has to be paid the exact same, right? And why can you, as an employer or in HR, make an offer to someone that's higher or lower? You should be using similar metrics within your organization, and those should be metrics that are determined by the Massachusetts Pay Equity Act, right? The variations in wages are not prohibited if they're based on one of the following: seniority, right? If you're basing things on seniority and someone gets paid more because they're more senior, and that's seniority in your entity or just generally they have more experience, right? If they're, even if it's not seniority in your company, if they have more seniority in their position, generally speaking, they can be paid more. Okay. Merit is another reason to pay people more. That's a little bit fuzzy, and we'll talk about what merit means in a minute. Production, sales, and revenue, right? We talked about commission, right? We talked about commission-only employees. You can pay people more when they produce more. There's nothing illegal about that. Geographic location, to the extent your employees are located in a different area. For instance, your Boston employees can make more than your South Shore-based employees or your Plymouth-based employees. And obviously that's because the cost of getting into Boston and potentially commuting and parking and all of those things, you can pay people more based on the geographic location. Also the market, right? We all know that if you work way out in maybe Worcester, you may earn less than if you work in downtown Boston. So those are all things that are totally appropriate and you can look at when you're conducting your internal audits.
We love our Worcester
Education,
people,
training,
Jen.
and experience. Jeff, go ahead, sorry.
I said we love our Worcester people, Jen.
We do. We know you're from Worcester, so we've got to give Worcester a plug. Education, training, and experience. So if someone has a degree or a master's degree or has particular training, has particular licensure, has particular credentials, you can pay those individuals more. And so that's a legitimate reason for a pay difference. Also travel. If one person travels and the other person has the same job but isn't required to travel, they can make less because they don't travel. If you travel, you can make more. So those are the permissible reasons that you can pay people different amounts. So it's important that you're thinking about that as you think about pay transparency, pay ranges, and all of those things.
And this is just a quick pause here. So this is why this topic is going to be really important, because in an ideal world, and Jen, I assume you ideally don't want to be having this conversation with an employee, right? You don't want to have this conversation of, well, this person's actually more senior than you, or, this person is located in an area where we just have to pay. Those type of conversations end up being, I guess, they can be a little bit heated depending on what the context is, but that's where this pay transparency law, some of these conversations might end up happening where some employee where you might have to explain, well, the mass pay equity, those are conversations you ideally don't want to have. So having a plan around this entire thing, especially with current employees, and if you have a bunch of job openings, it's important to come up with just some kind of internal plan, not only for the HR leaders on the phone, but for the managers as well, because they're the ones that might be fielding some of these questions. And it's just conversations that ideally, I assume your managers probably don't want to have with employees, where they have to explain, well, Susie actually lives in Boston and Jane lives in Worcester, so she actually gets to make more. Having those conversations just create an internal, a little bit of a conflict. So having a plan around this topic as a whole is going to be really important. And Jen, I don't know if my guess is you would not want your clients and their managers having this conversation with all of their employees on an ongoing basis. That usually is
Right, but I
in
think
a
that
bad
being
spot.
prepared to answer these difficult
Yep.
questions when they come to you, and knowing why you're paying people differently than other people is very important. And knowing that you can stand behind it and that it's legal and that you've vetted it out is really crucial. So making sure you've done your due diligence so that if you are called out or called to task, you know the answers is going to be key. So I think we went over the allowable pay differences if you want to hit the next slide. So I talked a minute ago about merit and what that means. So basically, the law defines it a little bit more detailed as variations in pay based on employee performance measured through legitimate job criteria. So written performance rating plans or policies, scaled review processes, those kinds of situations are merit systems. It can't be something very loose. It has to be something that you do. For instance, you have metrics, you're grading people, you have a performance rating process, and then they get a merit bonus. And that they might get more than their counterpart, and that's okay because they got a higher ranking. But it really needs to be a system. It can't just be something that's loose that you pull out of the air and you're paying people different amounts for no apparent reason, right? You want to be able to back it up.
I would say that's important takeaway number two, that, and I would say most people probably do have a system, but on the off case that you don't, same thing as I know we'll go in. One of the things I remembered from the original pay, the pay equity audit that we talked about was making sure your job descriptions are up to date. That was a big takeaway that I took from that one, whenever it was 2 or 3 years ago. This is another one. So just making sure that if things are paid differently, make sure that there is something that you can lean on. And I assume, Jen, your advice would be to make sure that whatever that something is, legal counsel has reviewed and made sure that it all makes sense, et cetera.
Exactly. You just want to make sure if you're relying on merit to do a pay differential, you want to make sure that there's something specifically in writing, that it makes sense, that it's been vetted, and that you're following it. If it's something else that's causing your pay difference, like production, so sales or revenue generation, that's very easy, right? Because those numbers don't lie, and you'll be able to show that to the extent that somebody sues you for violation of pay equity. So just make sure whatever the pay difference is, you know why you're paying people differently, and you can legitimately say that it meets one of those pay differences. So what's unlawful
before
under
we get here,
NEPA?
Jen, we had a couple of questions come in. So
Oh, and I think there's a couple good ones. Jeff, I'll let you read those and ask them as I'm going through this next slide. So the unlawful practices, just so everyone knows, and most people are up to date on this, but this MEPA law now requires, as of 2018, and most of you I think are doing this and you're compliant, you are not allowed to inquire as to what somebody is currently earning at their company. And most people are doing a good job with this, but the only question you can ask is, what are your salary expectations? What are you expecting to earn in this role? You can ask them what they want to earn, but you cannot ask them what they currently make. And that is because they're trying to close the equity gap, right? They're trying to close that gender gap. And if a woman comes in and says, I make $17 an hour, you're going to pay her $17 an hour, even if all the men in your company make $20 an hour. Not all employers would do that, but some will. And so that's why instead of doing that, they're requiring you post the ranges. They're asking the employee to then just say what their expectations are. So just so people are understanding, that's not allowed anymore. And I think you were all up to speed on this because it's been in place for a few years now. So you can't seek salary history prior to negotiation. And also you can't require that employees not discuss their wages with one another, which was a big thing with this particular law. So if people want to talk about their wages with one another, you can't prohibit it. You also can't retaliate against people for any of those things. So just beware of those items. So Jeff, do you want to go through a few of the comments that we're getting on the chat?
Yep. And we all know employees all talk to each other about everything. So there's no secrets. So we kind of know what's going on. So this is a great question that came in from Carmen. Thank you. So can you please clarify travel as those factor in pay? Did you say that those who incur greater travel costs due to their geographic location is justifiable for increased pay? So for example, if I choose to live in Worcester, lower cost of living, and commute into Boston, my employer can pay me more than my colleague who lives in Boston. And then the clarifying was, I thought the travel component meant those who are required to actually travel, like let me jump on a plane and, go.
So there's two different things. One is geographic location and one is travel. So the geographic location means that the market would bear more for employees that are going to Boston. right? If you're employed in Boston, there's the market there, typically employees are going to make more money than maybe if you're out in Worcester or even further out in Springfield, right? So that's a market condition. So if you decide as a company, we're going to pay employees more in Boston to attract the talent we need in Boston, that's a legitimate pay differential. Travel is different when it's part of your job. It's not commuting time. I'm not talking about commuting time. And I think that that's where I'm not sure if I muddied the waters at some point when I was speaking. Commuting time is not something that we're talking about. We're talking about work travel. So you're right. Those that go to trade shows, they go to sales visits, they're flying across the country. If you have an outside salesperson that's flying across the country, you can pay them more than maybe an outside salesperson that's just going to Massachusetts-based companies or an inside salesperson, right? Because obviously that travel component, they're going to be outside of their home, they're going to be away from their family. There's something to be said for all of that. So that pay differential is legitimate. So you've got geographic location, which can lead to discrepancies that are allowable, and you've got travel, and that travel is really required travel for the job, not commuting time.
Right, and that the clarifier that Carmen just added, so there's not a pay differential for just commuting time
Yes.
or voluntary geographic location.
Exactly, right. So if you choose to live somewhere and you commute into Boston, that's your choice, right? The company doesn't have to pay a pay differential because of that, and there doesn't have to be anything taken into consideration. It's really about geography and the market, right? And usually, traditionally, a Boston market is going to demand a little bit of a higher pay than something in the suburbs or further away from the downtown area.
And then, so another couple questions here, so we want to pause here for a sec. So is there a consideration for when you hire someone, pre-inflation starting salary versus post, or a restructuring of salary bands?
Yes, that's a great question. And so this law, MEPA, and the Pay Transparency Act basically says market conditions and intent, it doesn't matter, right? And so if you hired somebody at the height of the market and now the market's come down, that's not an allowable reason for a pay differential. So that's really hard on employers, right? Because we all know that the market was so tough to get people in the door post-COVID, and it's finally kind of loosening up, but unemployment rates are still extremely at historic lows, right? So the market's still tight. There's not a lot of people unemployed. The market's tight. To get people to come work for you, you really have to be giving a lot to the employees. Wages have gone up. They're historically high right now. So it's been an employee market, right? And so to the extent that there's a pay differential because you hired somebody 20 years ago when the market was low or whatever the timing was, or now the market's kind of slowing down, you still have to make sure that there's one of those legitimate permissible differences in place, and it can't be related to just the market volatility. And I know that stinks, but that's just the law.
It does, because we saw that, because post-COVID it was an employees market, we call it a buyer's market if employees are the buyer, and it was higher salaries than you've seen. It was flexibility of working from home. It was employees wouldn't even listen to an employer if those were if they weren't, salary was more and they had all the flexibility in the world. But then we saw that kind of flip at the end of 2023, I believe, where we saw some bigger layoffs, and I assume the wages probably sort of market corrected a little bit. So now, if you're going the other direction, like you said, it's unfortunately the market ebbs and flows aren't a good reason for this. So all more reason just to kind of have a plan in place.
Agreed.
One more question that came in, Jen. So can an employee request that the company disclose what another employee is earning?
So the answer to that is no. So that's good. But the employee can request a pay range for a job position. So that can be demanded, and you would have to adhere to that and provide the pay range for that role, that job title. And so that is an appropriate ask. They cannot ask specifically what somebody else makes. Now, if somebody else wants to disclose that to them, they can. Like if I want to tell somebody else what I make as an employee, I can do that. And you can't prohibit it. So handbooks used to say, back in the day, people shouldn't discuss their wages with one another and, things like that. You can no longer have those provisions in your handbook that prohibit the discussion of wages with other employees, but you don't have to disclose what another employee specifically is making. That would be a violation of their confidentiality.
Yeah, and I just had a question come in that sort of was reading my mind. And the question is, so if hiring teachers, for example, can you just say per the, ABC district teacher salary scale, there's a very wide possibility of ranges based on steps, degrees, credits. So my question was, in that scenario that you just mentioned, do they define, I guess I know you kind of talked about define the range. So if, you're trying to say, well, the real salary for this position is like 75 grand, but, I'm going to say the range is 25 to 250 and, somewhere in between. And then you put the caveat that, oh, well, it's based on these, 25 different
Criteria, right.
variables,
Yeah,
and all of a
exactly.
sudden you need an actuarial firm to figure it out.
Right. And that's what we're wondering if the AG is going to give us some guidance on, because right now it's not defined. Like pay range there's nothing really in the statute that gives us specifically what that means. If for those that have read the law, it's actually really short. It's not a long statute. And so there's nothing that really says what pay range means. So it's all up for interpretation right now, which a lot of people are saying, are we going to see these huge $50,000, $100,000 ranges, which really doesn't help kind of what the target of the law is. But that's why I'm thinking the AG may provide additional guidance on that.
Right. And I would assume, Jen, just best practice, if, if I'm a potential employee, the wider that range is, the more, I don't know if fishy is the right word, but the more fishy it might look. So I would assume best practice is to be, to be honest about, the bottom end of your scale plus the top end of your scale, and put realistic, variables in place where you can justify, well, if this is your experience, here's kind of the base of where we would go. Two, if your experience is, these 5 things that meet exactly what we're looking for like an A+ performer in this role, then here's the top end. And if that is a bigger range, I assume as long as you can sort of justify it, then that makes sense.
Agreed. Yeah, I think you want those ranges to be somewhat tight, but I know even as an employer myself, if I'm hiring for a lawyer, there is a big discrepancy as to what we might pay someone, right? Because it depends on how much experience they have. It depends on what they've been doing with their experience in the last X amount of time they've been practicing. So there's a lot of variables, and there can be a wide pay range, but I think you kind of know what the range is going to be. So you have to keep it as tight as you can.
Yeah, and then the one question that just came in before we move on to the next one is, can you have a hiring range that is narrower than the overall salary range?
So yeah, I mean, I think you can, if that's what you're going to be in the range for hiring. If it's legitimately what the range is for people that you're going to be bringing in onboarding, then you can put that range in. If people that are already with you make more than that because they've been with you longer or they have more experience, then that's okay, right? Because you're not going to hire someone maybe out of the gate that makes the same as the people that are in your company that have been there a long time.
Right. Yeah, someone said, I've seen expected starting salary typically is ... So if you're
Yes.
hiring someone, you're looking for, a more junior person, then obviously that range is going to be lower than the overall capacity.
Yep, I think that's great feedback from the chat. So strict liability and defense. So this law probably wasn't written with business people at the table because it has strict liability. So if you don't have a permissible pay difference, salary history, market conditions, those kinds of things, intent, it doesn't matter, right? If your intention was good or the market was tough, or the law doesn't care about that. So there's strict liability. If you're not paying people equitably the same amount, or if there isn't that allowable difference based on those reasons that I identified, you will be liable for a violation of the pay equity law. So that's huge liability. What's important though is that this law does come with a parachute for employers that everybody since 2018 should be taking advantage of. And that is, and even the Commonwealth used this defense in a lawsuit that was brought by an employee of the Commonwealth and succeeded. So that's kind of interesting, right? Even the Commonwealth had conducted a pay equity audit of its own agency and succeeded when an employee brought a claim for gender discrimination and gender disparity in pay. So there's a complete defense if you've conducted a pay audit within the last 3 years prior to the lawsuit, provided that audit was done in good faith and reasonable in detail and scope. And you've made reasonable progress towards eliminating pay differentials. And that doesn't mean eliminating them overnight. It just means you have a plan and you're working towards closing those gaps. And you're going to do it annually or at review times. You're going to maybe bump up that female employee a little bit more and close that gap, or whatever the case is. So you've recognized what the pay disparities are. You've made a plan toward closing those pay disparities. If you do that, you get a get out of jail free card, which is unusual, right? So take advantage of this. This is something, as you're going through and preparing for 2025, and you're thinking about pay transparency and getting your pay ranges together, figuring out what your pay ranges are going to be for your positions that you're posting, this is the time, right? You can do this pay audit at the same time as preparing for pay transparency. And that's why these two laws really go hand in hand. So there's even a partial defense. If you've done an audit, but it wasn't very good, it wasn't very detailed in scope, and it was done in good faith, but it's kind of not very good, they'll give you a partial defense, meaning you do not have to pay any liquidated damages. So those triple damages that come along with Wage Act violations, you don't have to pay those. You would only have to pay a straight damage, meaning, just that straight differential that the person didn't receive the time that they were employed. So again, these audits are huge and they're very valuable. And then not only are they valuable for the pay equity audit, but they're valuable on the pay transparency side as well, to make sure that everybody's kind of in line and you know what you're paying people. Also, the evaluations can't be used as evidence against you. So they can't, the government's made it so that you can do this and you don't have to fear that someone's going to take that audit and say, well, look at this, they're paying all these women less than they're paying the men. If you've done the audit, they're going to allow you to use that as a defense and not allow it to be used against you in any way.
And just before we jump into this, I'm just going to do a quick time check. So we do have 90 minutes. I know there were some people that did have to jump off at 10. This is going to be available. So I know we're kind of getting into an important piece of how to do a pay equity audit. But if there are people that have a 10 o'clock commitment and they need to go, we understand that. We did budget for 90 minutes here, but I just wanted to throw a quick time check out there. And then we did have a quick question come in before we get this. So what if a small employer over 25 employees doesn't typically advertise or post for candidates, but they just hire through, kind of organic word of mouth? Do they need to somehow publish the range to potential candidates?
Not really, no. I mean, there's no requirement that you advertise in a particular way. If you do word of mouth advertising, what I would say is you would say, oh, well, the range for this position is X to Y, as you're kind of spreading the word. But, the fact is it's going to be very difficult for somebody to kind of come after you, or for you to violate the law if you're not posting anything in writing on Indeed, LinkedIn, any other job boards. If there's nothing in writing, it would be very hard for somebody to say, well, they didn't do what they were supposed to do. Just know, though, this does apply to internal hirings. This does apply. So the pay range is supposed to be something that's readily available for internal people and word of mouth. So I would have it prepared, but you don't necessarily have to post it anywhere or publish it anywhere. So how to conduct pay equity audits, 3 steps. So first, you're going to look at what jobs are comparable. So you're looking at the job title, but you're also looking more holistically at what the skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions are. For instance, if you have 2 assistant managers, let's say, and one has 2 employees that they oversee and one has 20, that's a lot different, right? You can pay your assistant manager that's overseeing 20 employees more than you pay somebody that's overseeing 2, even though they have the same exact description. The job title is the same. So you want to look at those things. Is it really comparable if they're managing 20 people to 2 people? Probably not, right? Are the people paid equally? And then if they're not, does one of those exceptions apply? So we're looking at that. This really should be done on a spreadsheet. It should be devoid of any identifying information as far as the name of the employee. So they should be numbered only as far as to recognize their employee number by some unidentifying way, because again, you don't want to know who the people are that are associated with the roles. And again, depending on how large the organization is, it's very small. It's very hard, right? If you have a small company, even if you take their names out, you know who it is. But the larger the organization is, the more likely you may not know who the individuals are when there's no name affiliated with it.
The one thing that we've heard through the marketplace is this type of salary benchmarking is very hard to come by. So if you are in a company that maybe hasn't hired, but all of a sudden you're experiencing growth, maybe you've acquired because there's been a lot of mergers and acquisitions over the last couple of years. It's an information that might not necessarily be readily available. So that's why, again, just in the grand scheme of what's coming, we just want to make sure that everyone's not scrambling in January to look at this. We do have, there are a couple external partners that do some salary benchmarking type of work, but it's not super easy information to come by. So that's where if you do think you need to do a little bit of benchmarking to say, are these salaries kind of up to snuff versus market standards, et cetera. That's where we just want to say you might want to start that a little bit earlier.
And then for the analysis on the pay equity audit, you want to have that identifier. Obviously, you want gender, because remember, MIPA is a gender-based law. You also want to have job title, location, full-time, part-time, type of pay, benefit eligibility, date of hire, travel, shift worked or differentials, licensure, certification, education, total comp. So those are some of the tabs on your Excel spreadsheet, some of the columns that you're going to want, so that when you're sorting and you're thinking through whether or not people are paid equitably, you can look through these items to analyze it. Then you want to have all your job descriptions to make sure that you're looking, are these comparable positions and how are they comparable? And if they're not comparable, how do you make the distinctions to say they're not the same job?
I know we did have a question come in, probably a conversation not many people want to have with an employee, but someone who's paid well above a reasonable range of pay. The question is, how do you take steps to address? And I would assume that means address, meaning bring it back into something a little bit more in line with what a benchmark would say, but I assume that's not an easy conversation to have.
Yeah, I mean, that's really a tricky one, Erin, I would say. I mean, I think that it's hard to take pay away. It's very demoralizing. So, obviously, legally, you've got one issue, right? And then you've got another issue, which is just running your business and thinking about how you keep employees there, how you keep them motivated. And I think if you were to go to that employee and say, well, we hired you when, the market was really high and you're making too much money and we have to take money away, I don't think that's going to fly. So you need to think strategically about how you address it, right? Do you close the gap by bringing other people up? Maybe, but maybe your company can't afford to bring all the other people in that role up, right? Maybe there's a strap on the liquidity in the business and you can't raise 3 other people's pay because this one outlier. So there's lots of different things that you need to think about from a business perspective as to how to handle this. And I don't think there's really one clear-cut answer. I would say, obviously, you could think about reducing the salary, but I think that long-term, you'd likely lose that employee just from a morale perspective. You could always try to change that employee's job title or job duties to be more in line with the range that they're in. But sometimes we all know we hire an employee and we pay them a certain amount, and then they're not really doing what it takes to deserve that amount. And now they're kind of doing a role that's lesser than, and they're being paid at that higher amount. Sometimes you do have to have those difficult conversations and say, look, we hired you for this role. You're really not fit for that role. And so we have to reevaluate. And we would love you to stay, but it would have to be in this different position, and it would come with a pay cut. And so if you're not comfortable with that, we understand you'd move on, but we kind of need to readjust. So just take that into consideration. I mean, there's a lot of ways to handle it, but it kind of depends on what the nature of this is and what the business is and whether there's a lot of other people in the role. And there's so many considerations.
So Jen, I'm going to ask an additional question on the back end of that. And, you kind of provided a scenario where the employee wasn't, up to par in the role. What about the employee that is doing a great job in that role, but just the salary benchmarks have just come down? Let's just call it $150,000 and they're doing a great job, et cetera. But now like the salary, the going rate for that type of thing is, let's say it's 105,000 instead of 150. So that's a much more difficult, a higher performer. And like you said, you can't bring 5 other people, you can't add 30% to their salaries to bring it even, but at the same time, like you
I
said, if
would
it
try to
makes
look
sense,
at those permissible pay differences and try to make the argument that there's a reason why they're getting so much more. If you can't, I would do that pay audit, pay equity audit, and I would have that, and I would have a plan as to how you're going to handle and address the discrepancy over time. And so even if it's not right away, trying to close that gap over time, because sometimes you do have these outliers and it's just because they were hired. Again, the law doesn't like nepotism. The law doesn't like market conditions. The law only wants you to look at those permissible pay differences.
thank you.
So what should you do next? You're going to review and create your salary ranges. You're going to have a lot of internal considerations, salaries of similarly situated individuals within the organization. In my opinion, now's the time to do your pay equity audits. You're looking at the job duties, managerial responsibilities, the skill sets, the training, the education requirements. You're thinking about external considerations too, to Jeff's point. What is the market data telling you about these roles? What are industry standards telling you about these roles? What's the cost of living, right now? What's the geography of the position? So all of the things you should be kind of thinking about as you're creating and reviewing the salary ranges to get prepared for pay transparency. Once the ranges are set, it's important to continually evaluate them to determine whether employees are appropriately classified and whether any compression issues with other positions are in effect or whether they're aligned with the market and the cost of living. And it's always important to have a strong communication plan. And I think Jeff has alluded to this several times, right? Around how salary ranges and compensation are determined, how compensation policy is addressed within your organization, how do you deal with pay increases or adjustments, whether there'll be performance-based increases or bonuses, how employees are classified. The company culture is very important here, and how you communicate these things, setting expectations, and those kinds of things can really avoid litigation and keep people happy and working in your organization.
Right. And I don't want to volunteer Jen's time, obviously, but if people want to just reach out, there's a need or an interest in just a pay equity workshop. I know we've done that in the past, and it's just kind of the blocking and tackling of how to just get that done. And from Jen, from what you said, it's not an overly complicated process. It's let's open up an Excel sheet, let's pull all our pay, let's see if we have a big red flag, and then let's come up with a plan to basically close the gap. And from what I remember from the last one, the plan isn't like a 6-month plan to close the gap. It could be like a multi-year plan.
It could be, correct.
Career
Yes.
development involved. There could be markers that people have to hit in order to close. There's a lot involved. Then you bring in your whole learning and development side of your organization to maybe, there are actual skills that are missing that we can do, whatever. And so it is a much bigger plan, but if that's something we can try to, I'm not sure when we would squeeze that in, but we can try to squeeze that in maybe right after the first of the year if there's a need for that.
Yeah, and I mean, we conduct pay equity audits for clients too. Because some people just want to farm it out, so that there's not just our law firm, but other law firms, other HR companies, sometimes will do it for companies. So if it's something you don't want to tackle on your own, there's people that could help with it as well. But if you do want to tackle it on your own, it's totally doable. It's something you can handle internally if you're up for that challenge.
Great.
So create those job descriptions, gather and analyze the data, do that pay equity audit, train human resources, managers, and others, right? Make sure they're not asking about pay history in the interview process. Make sure your job applications don't ask someone what they're currently making. Sometimes people have old, antiquated job applications. Make sure things are up to date. Make sure that when you're checking references, you're not asking what someone earned. Make sure you understand that the wage secrecy, you're not allowed to force people to keep their wages secret, and that make sure managers are trained that they're not able to retaliate if one of these issues arises. So review your forms, your policies, your procedures relative to pay transparency and pay equity.
Right, and that's the manager's one. The one I'm seeing as we always try to, have a little crystal ball and look into the future, but what's the one where we can foresee a problem here is where I think everyone on the call is probably going to be very well up to date on all of what's going on here, because we're going to be the ones, I say we like I'm doing it, but we're going to be the ones that are going to have to be managing this, doing all the filings, doing all this. But the managers that might be a little bit external to this situation, those are the ones that you want to make sure they might be ready for some potential, chatter behind the scenes, or even direct chatter of someone coming right to them and saying this, and that. And that's where you want to make sure people within your leadership team are all on the same page with what's going on. So that's as like kind of an external, this may be a problem, but let's try to nip it in the bud before it becomes a problem. That's something that we want to just make sure everyone's looking at. I believe the next slide is questions. And so the one thing I'll do while everyone is still here, so before we get to questions, I just want to give everyone just a mini preview of something that we at Apex have coming. It's not quite ready yet, but we have a fantastic well-being collective coming in 2025. So it's not a product to sell or anything. It's more of just a community to try to bring people together on, health and wellness, where we know health and wellness with health insurance has been kind of a long-term issue for everyone. And a lot of the wellness programs might not necessarily have some of the markers that you're looking for to get an ROI. Again, there's no product here. This is more just trying to bring a community of people together around these three major topics when it comes to health and wellness. And it's really more for a collaboration of just sharing. So I know anyone that's followed me knows I've shared my hiking pictures, I've shared cooking stuff, we shared all kinds of things. Our clients and companies out there have had such great ideas on how to manage the health and wellness. We get the best ideas from people in the marketplace. All we're looking to do is bring people together so we can actually share those ideas, because we're all kind of fighting the same battle. So we just want to make sure that there's a place for everyone to come together. So more information coming on that, but we're super excited about it. It's something that I've spent a ton of time on, kind of the holistic nutrition and health of myself over the last 12 months. So something we have coming next year just to try to bring everyone together. So hopefully that gets people as jazzed up as it's gotten me over the last couple of years, but something we have coming. So we'll shoot all this information out. It'll be public all over, LinkedIn. And I think we're going to try to have something on another social media channel as well. So just wanted to make sure we get to that. I'm super excited about it. So Jen, I didn't want to cut you off, but I want to make sure that we get to that before everyone jumped out. But if there are any other questions, Jen and I are obviously here. Jen is the expert. Not to overflow Jen's inbox, but any questions coming to me will probably end up in Jen's inbox as well. So we're happy to help however we can. But a lot of things coming, but some of the big takeaways, obviously, make sure you're prepared. Make sure our managers are prepared on fielding some of these questions. Make sure you have your policies in line, and the pay equity audit, as Jen mentioned, is a very rare get out of jail free card.
And we'll keep you posted on that February date, and if there's a site available to upload the EEO-1 forms and how that's going to roll out, and whether or not the pay data is going to be attached and how. So as soon as we get more information, Jeff and I will make sure we get it out to everybody.
And if anything changes or something happens, obviously we'll jump on and we can just do one of the quick videos we used to do during COVID saying, oh, here's a change, just make sure everyone knows. So we'll do our best to stay on top of all that as well. I think that's all we had. So we just want to thank everyone for jumping on. Very excited to kick off another webinar for our first webinar for Apex. And Jen, as always, an invaluable resource. We appreciate it so much.
Thanks, Jeff.
Great.
Take care, everybody.
Everyone. Bye.